The year is 1943, and while American troops push across North Africa and Europe, another chapter of the war is unfolding far from the front lines. On quiet farmlands, in small towns, and behind barbed wire across nearly every state, more than 400,000 German soldiers are living as prisoners on American soil. They work in fields, form orchestras, play soccer, and wait for a war they can no longer fight. To many Americans, these men were the enemy, yet daily life in the camps was far more complex than simple hatred or fear. This is the story of a forgotten world inside America, where war and humanity met in unexpected ways. Now we begin with how these prisoners first arrived.
The arrival of German prisoners of war in the United States was never part of the original American war plan. When the nation entered World War II in December 1941, military planners focused on mobilizing millions of soldiers, building the arsenal of democracy, and preparing for combat on two fronts. The concept of housing enemy prisoners on American soil seemed distant, almost unthinkable. The United States had limited experience with prisoners of war from the First World War, and the military infrastructure to manage large populations of captives simply did not exist. Everything changed in 1942 and 1943. As Allied forces gained momentum in North Africa, thousands of German soldiers from Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps found themselves overwhelmed and captured. The British, already straining under the burden of housing prisoners while managing the war effort and recovering from the devastation of the Blitz, could no longer accommodate the growing numbers. They looked to their American allies for assistance. The solution was as practical as it was unprecedented. Ships that transported American troops and military supplies to Europe would return with a different cargo: German prisoners of war. Liberty ships, which would otherwise sail empty across the Atlantic, were converted into floating detention centers. As many as 30,000 prisoners arrived each month at the ports of New York and Norfolk, Virginia, forming orderly lines as they disembarked onto American soil for the first time. The numbers grew staggering. After the Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, the flow of prisoners increased dramatically. By the final months of the war, 60,000 German soldiers per month were being shipped to the United States. The military faced an enormous logistical challenge. These men needed to be fed, housed, clothed, and managed according to international law, even as the American public grappled with war rationing and the mounting casualties of their own soldiers overseas. The Geneva Convention of 1929 provided the legal framework for this unprecedented undertaking. This international treaty, signed by dozens of nations, including the United States and Germany, established clear rules for the treatment of prisoners of war. Prisoners were to be treated humanely, housed in conditions comparable to the detaining nation's own soldiers, provided adequate food and medical care, and protected from violence and public ridicule. They could be required to work, but only for fair compensation and never directly supporting the war effort against their own country. The American government took its obligations under the Geneva Convention seriously, though not entirely out of altruism. Every German prisoner held in American camps represented an American prisoner potentially held in German camps. The government understood that the treatment of German prisoners on American soil could directly influence how American prisoners were treated in Germany. It was a calculated strategy wrapped in the language of international law and human dignity.
The construction of prisoner of war camps across America happened with remarkable speed. Military planners selected locations based on several criteria. The camps needed to be far from coastal areas and industrial centers for security reasons, at least 170 miles from the ocean and 150 miles from the Mexican and Canadian borders. They required mild climates to reduce heating costs and construction expenses. Most importantly, they needed to be in agricultural regions where prisoner labor could address the nation's growing farm labor shortage. Texas became the epicenter of the POW camp system, hosting more camps than any other state. The logic was peculiar but practical. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners be housed in climates similar to where they were captured. Since many German soldiers had been captured in the desert heat of North Africa, the dry expanses of Texas seemed appropriate. By war's end, Texas held nearly 79,000 prisoners across dozens of installations. The camps themselves varied dramatically in size and character. Major base camps could house up to 12,000 prisoners, complete with administrative buildings, medical facilities, recreation halls, and multiple compounds separated by rank and military branch. Camp Carson in Colorado, later known as Fort Carson, served as the largest installation in its region. Other facilities were far more modest, temporary structures built on existing military bases or hastily erected in rural areas. Each camp followed a standard design prescribed by military engineers. Barbed wire fencing 8 feet high surrounded the perimeter, punctuated by guard towers at regular intervals. Inside, the compounds were divided into sections, housing between 500 and 700 men each. Barracks provided 40 square feet of space per enlisted prisoner, meeting the Geneva Convention's requirements. Separate buildings served as mess halls, infirmaries, and recreational facilities. Beyond the barbed wire and guard towers, the camps looked remarkably ordinary. They resembled standard American or German military training facilities, with neat rows of wooden buildings, open spaces for sports and exercise, and infrastructure that would have been familiar to any soldier. This was intentional. The camps were designed not to punish, but to contain, to meet international obligations while serving practical needs. The smaller branch camps presented a different picture. These satellite facilities, often attached to larger base camps administratively, dotted the American countryside. Some housed fewer than 50 prisoners stationed near farms, canneries, or lumber mills. Security at these remote outposts was often minimal, sometimes consisting of a single guard or merely a driver who transported prisoners to and from work sites each day. By 1944, the infrastructure was complete. Over 425,000 German prisoners lived in 700 camps spread across nearly every state in the Union. Only Vermont, Nevada, and North Dakota remained free of POW camps. The facilities existed in Hawaii, then a territory scarred by the attack on Pearl Harbor. The system represented an extraordinary achievement of wartime logistics and a transformation of the American landscape that few civilians fully understood.
For the German prisoners who stepped off transport ships and into American camps, the initial shock was profound. Many had grown up in the economic devastation of post-World War I Germany, in modest apartments without modern conveniences. Some had experienced the hardships of combat in North Africa or Europe, living in trenches, surviving on limited rations, and facing constant danger. The contrast with their new circumstances proved jarring. The food alone astonished many prisoners. The Geneva Convention mandated that prisoners receive the same rations as the soldiers guarding them. This meant 3 substantial meals a day, prepared with ingredients that were rationed or completely unavailable to civilians back in Germany. Breakfast might include eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch and dinner featured meat, fresh vegetables, bread, and desserts. Special meals marked Thanksgiving and Christmas. General officers even received wine with their meals, as specified in the convention's protocols. One German prisoner later recalled his time in American captivity with remarkable candor. When captured, he weighed 128 pounds. After 2 years as an American prisoner of war, he weighed 185 pounds. He had, as he put it, become so heavy that his eyes seemed to disappear into his face. The abundance was so dramatic that prisoners initially burned leftover food, fearing their rations would be reduced if guards discovered they could not eat everything provided. Housing conditions matched the quality of the food. The barracks were heated in winter, ventilated in summer, and maintained to prevent disease. Prisoners slept on beds with mattresses, a luxury some had never experienced in their own homes. Medical facilities in each camp provided treatment for illness and injury. Red Cross inspectors visited regularly, documenting conditions and interviewing prisoners to ensure compliance with international standards. The camps provided extensive opportunities for recreation and intellectual enrichment.
Prisoners organized theatrical productions that drew audiences of hundreds, including American guards and local civilians invited to attend. Musical performances featured orchestras and choirs formed from musically trained prisoners. Camp libraries, though initially limited, grew to include thousands of books. The YMCA printed and distributed reading materials specifically for the camps, and prisoners often purchased their own books with money earned from work assignments. Sports became a central feature of camp life. Soccer fields occupied prominent positions within the compounds, and matches drew enthusiastic crowds of players and spectators. Prisoners played volleyball, handball, and other sports. Some camps constructed swimming pools. The physical activity provided an outlet for energy and a connection to normalcy in an abnormal situation. Educational opportunities flourished. Prisoners could take courses in English, mathematics, and various vocational skills. They had access to art supplies, woodworking tools, and musical instruments. Those with particular talents taught fellow prisoners, creating informal universities behind the wire. Many prisoners later credited this time with providing an education they could never have received in Germany. The camps maintained their own internal economies. Prisoners earned 80 cents per day for their labor, payment made in scrip rather than actual currency to prevent its use in escape attempts. This money allowed purchases at camp canteens, where fellow prisoners sold snacks, cigarettes, writing materials, and other goods. Some prisoners pooled their earnings to rent motion pictures, buy radios for their barracks, or purchase equipment for camp activities. Entertainment extended beyond what the prisoners created themselves. Movies were shown as frequently as 4 nights per week in some camps. The films served dual purposes: entertainment and subtle political messaging. Hollywood productions with anti-Nazi themes, animated cartoons, and documentaries about American democracy played to audiences who watched with varying degrees of interest and skepticism. The cinema became another tool in what would later be called re-education, though few prisoners recognized it as such at the time. Yet life behind the wire was not entirely comfortable or content. Homesickness plagued many prisoners, particularly as the war dragged on and letters from family became less frequent. The uncertainty of when they would return home created anxiety. Some prisoners had wives and children they had not seen for years. Others worried about family members caught in the bombing campaigns that increasingly devastated German cities.
The decision to employ German prisoners in American agriculture and industry was born of necessity rather than planning. As millions of American men joined the military, the nation faced acute labor shortages across multiple sectors. Farms struggled to harvest crops. Canneries could not process vegetables and fruits. Lumber mills lacked workers. The war had created the problem, and ironically, the war would provide an unexpected solution. The Geneva Convention permitted prisoners to work under specific conditions. The labor could not directly support military operations against their own country. Officers could not be compelled to work, though they could volunteer. Prisoners must be paid for their labor and treated humanely. Work assignments must not be excessively dangerous or degrading. Within these parameters, American authorities saw an opportunity to address labor shortages while keeping prisoners productively occupied. The Emergency Farm Labor Program became the primary employer of prisoner labor. German POWs picked cotton in Texas, harvested wheat in Kansas, gathered asparagus in California, and worked sugar beet fields in Nebraska. They cut timber in the forests of the Pacific Northwest and the South. They worked in canneries processing the food that would feed both military personnel and civilians. The scope of their contribution was enormous, measured in millions of dollars saved and harvests rescued from potential loss. The daily routine of working prisoners followed predictable patterns. A typical day at an agricultural worksite began at 7:30 in the morning when military trucks arrived at the camp to transport prisoners to farms across the region. Guards accompanied them, though the level of supervision varied dramatically depending on location and the perceived risk of escape. Some farms saw prisoners working alongside American civilians or even the farmers' families. Others maintained stricter separation. The workday could be demanding. Prisoners picking oranges in California were expected to fill 36 boxes per day. Cotton picking in the hot Texas sun tested endurance and resolve. Lumber work required physical strength and carried genuine risks of injury. Yet compared to combat, compared to the uncertainty and danger they had faced as soldiers, most prisoners viewed the work as acceptable, even desirable. It provided structure, purpose, and a distraction from the tedium of camp life. Payment for labor created an unexpected economic phenomenon. While 80 cents per day seems modest by modern standards, it represented real wages in the 1940s economy. Prisoners accumulated substantial savings over months and years of work. Some returned to Germany at war's end with hundreds of dollars in their possession, small fortunes in a nation whose economy lay in ruins. This money would help families survive the difficult post-war years and contribute, in a small way, to Germany's eventual recovery. The American government also profited from prisoner labor. In 1944 alone, the government collected $22 million from prisoner wages, money that helped offset the costs of running the POW camp system. Officials estimated that using prisoners in military installations saved an additional $80 million that year. The program proved economically beneficial to all parties involved, an unusual outcome in wartime. The interaction between German prisoners and American civilians created unpredictable dynamics. Strict regulations forbade fraternization, but reality often diverged from policy. Prisoners working on family farms sometimes developed relationships with the farmers and their families. They shared meals, learned English, and exchanged stories. Some farmers saw not enemies, but young men caught in circumstances beyond their control, teenagers and young adults who reminded them of their own sons serving overseas. Notable instances of fraternization became part of local law. In South Carolina, a farming family invited German prisoners working their land to share Christmas dinner. The evening ended with everyone gathered around the piano, singing Christmas carols together while war raged across the ocean. In Colorado, a woman carried on a romantic relationship with a German prisoner for months, driving out to meet him along farm roads. When the relationship was discovered, she faced no charges, though the prisoner was transferred to another camp. In countless small towns, barriers erected by war gradually eroded through daily human contact. Not all interactions were positive. Some American civilians resented the presence of well-fed, relatively comfortable German prisoners while their own sons died in combat. Letters poured into government offices demanding harsher treatment or immediate punishment. Labor unions objected to prisoner workers, arguing they displaced American civilians and undermined fair labor practices. The government walked a difficult line, trying to utilize prisoner labor while managing public perception and maintaining Geneva Convention compliance. Not all German prisoners arrived in American camps relieved to be out of the fighting or grateful for humane treatment. Among the hundreds of thousands of captured soldiers were devoted National Socialists, true believers in Hitler's ideology, who viewed captivity not as salvation but as temporary inconvenience. These men brought the war's ideological conflicts behind the wire, creating tension and sometimes violence within the camps themselves. The most dedicated Nazi loyalists organized themselves into informal hierarchies that mirrored the power structures of the Third Reich. They held secret celebrations of Hitler's birthday and other significant dates in the Nazi calendar, defying American authorities who had banned such observances. They conducted their own tribunals, judging fellow prisoners who seemed too friendly with their captors, or who spoke critically of Germany's war aims. The verdicts of these shadow courts carried serious consequences. American intelligence officials documented numerous instances of prisoners being coerced, threatened, or assaulted by their more militant comrades. Some investigations revealed evidence of what could only be described as unauthorized discipline within the compounds. Prisoners who collaborated with camp authorities or who expressed admiration for American democracy found themselves ostracized, threatened, or worse. The exact number of prisoners who died at the hands of their fellow captives remains unclear, but military records indicate that internal violence was a persistent concern for camp administrators. The American response to this internal warfare evolved over time. Initially, camp officials struggled to distinguish between ordinary prisoners and hardcore Nazi believers. The prisoners themselves were skilled at concealing their true loyalties, presenting cooperative facades to guards while maintaining rigid discipline within their own ranks. As patterns emerged and intelligence improved, authorities began identifying and segregating the most problematic prisoners. Special segregation camps were established to house known Nazi loyalists. These facilities, located in places like Alva, Oklahoma, concentrated the true believers in isolated compounds where they could not intimidate or harm other prisoners. Camp Trinidad in Colorado gained particular notoriety as a haven for Nazi activity. Intelligence reports described it as one of the most important centers in the country for counterintelligence work, a place where the ideological war continued behind American barbed wire. The segregation policy had mixed results. Removing the most militant prisoners improved conditions in many camps, allowing for better prisoner cooperation and more successful work programs. However, the segregation camps themselves became centers of continued resistance. Guards reported continued Nazi propaganda, secret military-style formations, and persistent hostility toward American authority. These prisoners viewed themselves as soldiers, still fighting the war through non-cooperation and defiance. One particularly troubling incident illustrated the depth of ideological commitment among some prisoners. At Camp Concordia in Kansas, a German prisoner was shot and killed while attempting to retrieve a soccer ball that had gone beyond the designated boundaries. Witnesses reported that the prisoner had been repeatedly warned about the caution line, a barrier marked by warning signs in both English and German, positioned 18 feet from the main fence. The prisoner, Adolf Hübner, deliberately kicked the ball into the forbidden area, then hopped over the rail and ran after it while looking back and taunting the guard. The sentinel fired once, and Hübner died from the wound. The incident sparked debate about whether the shooting was justified or whether the guard had overreacted. It highlighted the tensions that could escalate in seconds, the cultural misunderstandings, and the tragic consequences when young men with weapons faced young men testing boundaries. Other violent incidents stemmed from personal animosity rather than ideology. At an unnamed camp, a guard admitted to firing multiple rounds into a compound simply because he harbored deep hatred for Germans and wanted them dead. The confession came only after the fact, revealing a failure in screening and training processes. Similar incidents occurred elsewhere, though most attracted little public attention. The military preferred to handle such matters internally, avoiding publicity that might complicate international relations or provide propaganda material to Germany.
Despite the relatively comfortable conditions and the geographic isolation from Germany, some prisoners attempted to escape. The total number surprised even military officials. Of the 425,000 German prisoners held in the United States during the war, only 2,222 attempted escape, less than 1%. This rate was lower than that of Italian prisoners held in American camps and significantly lower than the civilian prison escape rate. The vast distance from home, the challenge of blending into American society while speaking limited English, and the general recognition that life in the camps was preferable to continued combat, all contributed to the low escape rate. Most escape attempts were motivated by boredom rather than any realistic hope of reaching Germany. Prisoners understood that returning to their units overseas was virtually impossible. Some harbored romantic notions of reaching Mexico or South America, perhaps finding passage on a ship bound for German-controlled territory in Europe. Others simply wanted adventure, a break from the monotony of camp routine, or the chance to test themselves against their captors one more time. The most famous escape occurred on December 23, 1944, at Camp Papago Park in Arizona. 25 German prisoners, mostly U-boat officers and crew members, spent 4 months secretly digging a tunnel from their compound to beyond the fence line. The tunnel stretched 178 feet through the desert soil, an engineering achievement accomplished with improvised tools and remarkable patience. The escape was carefully planned and coordinated. On the day of the breakout, prisoners staged a volleyball demonstration to distract guards, while their comrades, one by one, slipped into the tunnel entrance hidden in a barracks. The escape went undetected for hours. By the time guards conducted an evening head count and discovered prisoners missing, all 25 escapees had vanished into the Arizona night. The news created a sensation. Newspapers across the country carried headlines about Nazi prisoners loose in the American Southwest. Local residents locked their doors, reported suspicious sightings, and demanded action from authorities. The desert proved less hospitable than the prisoners had anticipated. Their plan involved following what maps showed as the Gila River to the Gulf of California, then finding passage to Mexico or South America. The maps had not indicated that the Gila River was often nothing more than a dry riverbed, particularly in winter. Faced with a vast, trackless desert, inadequate supplies, and the cold reality of their situation, the escapees began to reconsider their adventure. Within a week, 8 prisoners had surrendered or been recaptured. Some knocked on farmhouse doors, identified themselves, and asked the residents to call the police. One prisoner hitched a ride and asked to be taken directly to the sheriff's office. Another, tired, wet, and cold from the desert weather, simply turned himself in. By January, all 25 escapees were back in custody. The Great Escape had become a great failure, though the tunnel itself remained an impressive engineering achievement that camp officials preserved as evidence of prisoner ingenuity and determination. Other escape attempts followed similar patterns. 3 prisoners walked away from an agricultural work camp near Fruita, Colorado, while harvesting sugar beets. They were discovered the following morning when a farm boy spotted them sleeping in a haystack.
4 Germans escaped from Fort Stanton, New Mexico, and were captured 2 days later after a brief confrontation with a posse of local ranchers. In most cases, the escapees remained at large for only hours or days before hunger, exhaustion, or the simple impossibility of their situation forced them to surrender. A handful of prisoners managed extended periods of freedom. Georg Gartner, a German soldier, terrified of being repatriated to his hometown in Silesia, which had become part of Soviet-controlled Poland, escaped from a camp in Deming, New Mexico on September 21, 1945, after the war had ended. He assumed a new identity as Dennis Wiles and lived quietly in California, Colorado, and Hawaii for 40 years before finally revealing his true identity in 1985. By then, the FBI had ended its search for him, and the government chose not to prosecute a man who had successfully built an American life. Gartner eventually became a United States citizen, a peculiar ending to an escape that had lasted 4 decades. The consequences of escape attempts varied. Prisoners who died during escapes typically received military funerals, complete with German flags provided by the United States government. This respectful treatment reflected America's commitment to Geneva Convention protocols, even in death. Those recaptured faced disciplinary measures within the camp system, but were not subject to severe punishment. The United States maintained its policy of treating prisoners according to international law, even when those prisoners violated camp rules or tested security measures.
In the fall of 1943, American military authorities initiated one of the war's most ambitious and controversial programs. The Special Projects Division, staffed by university professors and intellectuals, began a covert operation to re-educate German prisoners, attempting to expose them to democratic values and counter the effects of Nazi propaganda. The program walked a fine line, potentially violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition on exposing prisoners to political propaganda, while simultaneously preparing prisoners for life in a post-Nazi Germany. The re-education program employed subtle methods. Rather than overt lectures on democracy, the approach relied on cultural exposure and intellectual engagement. Prison libraries received books that had been banned in Nazi Germany, works by authors the Third Reich had condemned. Erich Maria Remarque's anti-war novel, All Quiet on the Western Front, circulated among prisoners who had never been permitted to read it in their homeland. Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain and Franz Werfel's The Song of Bernadette introduced prisoners to literature that challenged their understanding of German culture and history. The program published a newspaper called Der Ruf, or The Call, edited by sympathetic prisoners who had already turned against Nazi ideology. The newspaper carried articles about democracy, American history, and the reality of Nazi crimes. It presented information carefully, avoiding obvious propaganda, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about what prisoners had been told by their own government. The paper circulated through camps, read by thousands of men who had never encountered such perspectives before. Cinema became another tool in the re-education effort. Films shown in camp theaters included subtle and not-so-subtle political messages. Hollywood productions depicting Nazi brutality, animated cartoons mocking Hitler, and documentaries about American democracy played alongside entertainment features. The Why We Fight series, produced by the United States military, explained America's reasons for entering the war and challenged German assumptions about Allied intentions. Most films about the war focused on the Pacific theater, avoiding content that might create sympathy for German soldiers or resentment about how the war in Europe was portrayed. The effectiveness of the re-education program remains debatable. Many prisoners recognized the propaganda for what it was and resisted its messages.
Others had already lost faith in Nazi ideology before arriving in American camps, their disillusionment stemming from military defeat, battlefield experiences, or pre-existing doubts about Hitler's government. The program's administrators struggled to measure success, unable to determine whether changed attitudes reflected genuine conviction or pragmatic adaptation to captivity. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the re-education program accelerated. Intensive courses on democracy were offered to cooperative prisoners, condensed educational programs designed to prepare them to return to a Germany that would need to be rebuilt on different foundations. 25,000 prisoners graduated from these courses and were sent directly back to Germany rather than being retained for labor in Europe, a reward for participation and cooperation. The program faced internal opposition within the military itself. Many officers believed that attempting to change adult men's fundamental philosophies and values was both impossible and potentially counterproductive. They argued that prisoners who underwent successful re-education might become maladjusted on return to Germany, unable to function in a society still grappling with its Nazi past. Others questioned whether the United States had the right to engage in ideological programming of enemy prisoners, regardless of the eventual goals. Critics also noted practical limitations. The program reached only a fraction of the total prisoner population. Language barriers, prisoner resistance, and the sheer scale of the camp system made comprehensive re-education impossible. Some camps embraced the program enthusiastically, while others barely implemented it. The results varied dramatically depending on camp administration, prisoner attitudes, and available resources. Despite these challenges, the re-education program represented an important experiment in post-war planning. It acknowledged that military victory alone would not be sufficient to transform Germany. The society that had produced National Socialism would need to be rebuilt intellectually and culturally, as well as physically. The prisoners who returned home carrying books banned under Nazi rule, who had been exposed to democratic ideas and different perspectives, became informal ambassadors of change in a nation struggling to reimagine itself. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, the prisoners in American camps faced an uncertain future. The war that had defined their lives had ended, but their captivity continued. International law and practical considerations dictated that repatriation could not happen immediately. Germany lay in ruins, divided among occupying powers, its infrastructure destroyed, its cities reduced to rubble, and its population facing severe food shortages. Sending hundreds of thousands of additional men back to Germany would only exacerbate an already desperate situation. The process of repatriation began in November 1945, moving deliberately and methodically. The United States returned prisoners at a rate of approximately 50,000 per month, carefully coordinating with authorities in occupied Germany to ensure adequate facilities and resources existed to receive them. Many prisoners were first sent to France or Great Britain, where they worked in reconstruction efforts before eventual return to their homeland. This staged repatriation served multiple purposes. It provided needed labor for war-damaged Allied nations. It delayed the strain on Germany's limited resources, and it gave prisoners additional time to adjust to the reality of their nation's defeat. For the prisoners, repatriation brought mixed emotions. Some eagerly anticipated reunion with families they had not seen for years. Others dreaded returning to a Germany they no longer recognized, a nation occupied by foreign powers and struggling with the moral reckoning of what had been done in its name. Prisoners whose homes had been in Eastern territories, now controlled by the Soviet Union or Poland, faced particularly difficult circumstances, uncertain whether they would be allowed to return or what they would find if they did. Many prisoners expressed a desire to remain in the United States. Some had been born in America and held citizenship, but had been conscripted during visits to Germany before the war. Others had developed such appreciation for American life that they applied for permission to emigrate. The government denied these requests initially, maintaining that all prisoners must be returned to their country of service. However, in later years, some former prisoners successfully emigrated to the United States, bringing skills and perspectives shaped by their unique wartime experiences. The letters exchanged between prisoners and the Americans they had met during the war revealed the lasting impact of those connections. Families who had employed prisoner laborers on their farms maintained correspondence for years, sending food packages and clothing to help their former workers survive the deprivation of post-war Germany. Some Americans even traveled to Germany to visit the men they had come to know during the war, relationships that transcended nationality and ideology. The repatriation process was completed by 1946. The last prisoners departed American soil, taking with them memories that would shape their understanding of the world for the remainder of their lives. For many, the years spent in American captivity had been the most peaceful and prosperous of their entire wartime experience. They had been well fed, housed in decent conditions, treated according to international law, and given opportunities for education and personal development. This stood in stark contrast to the experiences of prisoners held by other nations during the same period. As the prisoners left, the camps began their own transformation. Buildings were auctioned, repurposed, or demolished. Some campsites became municipal airports, industrial parks, or housing developments. Others were absorbed into educational institutions or military facilities. The Camp Mexia site in Texas became a state facility for individuals with intellectual disabilities. Camp Swift in Texas was divided among a cancer research center, National Guard units, and a medium-security prison. The physical traces of the POW program gradually disappeared from the American landscape, leaving only scattered remnants and the memories of those who had experienced it. In Germany, the returning prisoners faced challenges their American captors had not anticipated. The economic devastation made even basic survival difficult. The moral reckoning with Nazi crimes created a complex psychological and social environment. Former soldiers, particularly those who had spent years removed from the worst aspects of the war, struggled to understand the full extent of what had been done in Germany's name. The knowledge they had gained about democracy, the books they had read, and the experiences they had accumulated in American camps influenced how they navigated this difficult transition. By 1946, only 7 German prisoners remained unaccounted for in the United States, men who had escaped and successfully evaded capture. Their fates varied, but most eventually surrendered or were discovered. The chapter of German prisoners of war in America had officially closed, though its legacy would continue to resonate for decades to come.
The story of German prisoners of war in the United States during World War II challenges simple narratives about the conflict. In a war characterized by unprecedented brutality, ideological extremism, and systematic atrocities, the treatment of German prisoners in America represented something different. It demonstrated that even in total war, nations could choose to uphold international agreements and maintain standards of human dignity. The Geneva Convention compliance maintained by the United States was not perfect. Individual guards sometimes acted out of hatred or prejudice. Security measures could be inadequate. The Reeducation program potentially violated the Convention's restrictions on propaganda. Yet, compared to the treatment of prisoners in other theaters of the war, the American approach stood apart. German prisoners in the United States had a death rate of less than 1%.
Compare this to the staggering mortality rates in Soviet camps, where over 1 million German prisoners died, or to the treatment of Allied prisoners by Japanese forces, where death rates exceeded 37%. This disparity in treatment was not accidental. It reflected a calculated American strategy. By treating German prisoners well, the United States hoped to encourage surrender, undermine German morale, and ensure reciprocal treatment of American prisoners. It also reflected American values and the nation's commitment to international law, even when that commitment proved unpopular with a public grieving their own casualties and sacrifices. The prisoner labor program addressed a critical need during a time of national emergency. Without the contributions of German prisoners, many American farms would have lost harvests, factories would have struggled to maintain production, and the home front economy would have faced severe additional strain. The prisoners fill the gap created by the millions of American men serving overseas, allowing the nation to maintain its agricultural and industrial output while fighting a two-front war. The human connections formed between prisoners and civilians remain among the most remarkable aspects of the story. In countless small towns across America, people encountered the enemy face to face and discovered shared humanity. Farmers who initially viewed prisoners with suspicion came to see them as individuals with families, hopes, and fears not unlike their own. These interactions, however brief or limited, challenged prejudices and created understanding that transcended the propaganda and hatred that characterized the war itself. The Reeducation program, despite its limitations and controversies, represented an early attempt at what would become a major focus of American post-war policy. The recognition that Germany would need to be reformed intellectually and culturally, not merely defeated militarily, guided the occupation policies that followed. The prisoners who returned home, having been exposed to democratic ideas and banned literature, carried seeds of change, however small, into a society that would need to fundamentally reimagine itself. The experience also raised questions that remain relevant today. How should nations treat enemy combatants during wartime? What obligations exist under international law, and how should they be balanced against security concerns and public sentiment? What role should re-education or rehabilitation play in detention policies? These questions, first confronted in the context of German POW camps, continue to challenge policymakers and ethicists in modern conflicts. The story of German POWs in America reveals a part of World War II often overlooked. Behind the fences, enemy soldiers lived lives shaped by routine, work, learning, and at times surprising human connection. Their experience challenged assumptions about loyalty, justice, and dignity in the middle of a global conflict. If you found this story compelling, subscribe and stay with us as we continue exploring the hidden corners of history.